Haunted Stories. 4 short horror stories. Written by Michael van der Voort. Narrated by Robin Reads. Erasmus Crane and the Cthulhu Murders. It was the early morning, at around 5 a.m., that I stepped down from the hansom cab and into the swirling murk of pre-dawn rain. Around me, the jaundiced glow of the gaslights offered a valiant but ultimately futile effort against the fog, and their hazy glow provided little by the way of illumination. I was therefore heartened to hear a familiar voice by my elbow. It was the voice of the great detective Erasmus Crane, who greeted me with a warmth that seemed somewhat out of place in the dull, melancholic drizzle of the freezing morning. Summoning me to follow, he calmly introduced another man who was standing beside him as a police detective by the name of Cooper. This Cooper was a large, mustachioed gentleman whose barrel chest seemed perfectly suited to his family name. He nodded in acknowledgment and led the way with the aid of his lamp down the narrow cobblestone alley and away from the main road. At length, we came to an intersection between 3 back streets, lit more clearly by an overhead gaslight and partitioned off by a thin stretch of rope that had been strung between the 2 walls, clearly with the intention of stopping the public, or any other interloper, from proceeding any further. Perceiving what lay just beyond that rope, however, I was convinced that this flimsy cord barrier actually served little purpose, since most men, upon catching even a glimpse of that grim tableau, would no doubt have turned heel in horror and raced in the opposite direction. Upon the ground, stretched out in a hideous flop of ragdoll contortions, was what remained of a young woman. She had evidently been not only killed, but butchered. Stripped of her clothes, which now lay in a tangled heap by her side, she had been slashed across the middle so that her innards, still slightly steaming in the cool of the morning, spilled out of her, only to have them been reorganized and placed in a carefully deliberate arrangement. Just below the ribcage, 2 almond shapes, presumably meant to represent eyes, had been daubed in blood on either side of the meridian line. Below them, torn forcibly out through a single horizontal slit, the intestines had been cut into tubes of similar length and splayed out in a fanned shape so that they writhed below, curling downward in a spread of grasping tendrils. The overall effect was to make the lower torso appear like the dangling tentacles of some great cephalopod, a hideous, squirming octopus merged with a man. Below this careful arrangement, the rest of the intestines were scattered, seemingly at random, upon the floor. It was therefore a great surprise to me when Crane asked that I take out my notebook and sketch as precisely as possible the configurations of the discarded organs. For a moment I railed against the idea, but catching the glint in his eye, recognized immediately that, were the gruesome task not of the utmost importance, he would not have asked it of me. "Take for your bearing the top of the head, which has been positioned to face east. Consider the rest to be proceeding from right to left in a roughly horizontal pattern, and try as best you can to record accurately each twist and flicker of the alignment." I felt my stomach churn as I began at once to record the requested details. As I did, Crane spoke in low but clearly audible tones to the police detective. "I am much obliged to you, Detective, for contacting me regarding this matter, and I can guarantee that my involvement in this inquiry will be treated with the utmost discretion." Crane paused and then gestured toward the body with the bowl of his pipe. "You will see, of course, that the visible bruises on this young lady's inner thighs cover a wide palette of colours, from purples and greens to light brown. This is indicative that they were sustained at different times during encounters unrelated to this incident. Some are newer, whilst others are well over a week old. I would therefore suggest that this unfortunate girl was engaged in the oldest profession. I would furthermore suggest that you consult Madame Hindy's at the establishment on Grey Street. All of the females in her employ wear the same orchid-based perfume, sourced by the madam herself, and the victim is clearly wearing it. Perhaps in this manner she might be easily identified, and through enquiries in the surrounding buildings some information gained as to the identities of her more regular clientele. I hope you will take the trouble to ensure a proper burial for her." Cooper nodded that he would, and, pleased by the confirmation, Crane continued. "As we see her now, this is how her body was found? None other than yourself has entered the vicinity?" Cooper again nodded that this was the case, before asking as to the significance of the sketches I was tasked with making. "Perhaps nothing," replied Crane flatly. "Though I think it's prudent to record every detail that may prove useful in future." At this he shot me a knowing glance, enquiring without ever saying a word whether I had concluded my sketches. I nodded in the affirmative, and Crane accordingly thanked the detective, assuring him that he would be in touch if and when any conclusions were reached. He then turned to leave, pausing only to add a single note of assistance. "I believe that once the body has been thoroughly examined, it will be easy enough for you to link this incident back to the dozen or so animal mutilations I wrote to you of previously, and to other incidents. This connection will be confirmed beyond a doubt when your doctor comes to examine the victim's liver." Cooper looked back at the body of the victim and back at Crane. The lack of footprints in the blood around the body and the lack of stains upon Crane's boots confirmed even to my own meagre powers of deduction that he had neither approached nor examined the body. Clearly Cooper had arrived at the same conclusion, and indeed had conjured up the same question that I had been tempted to ask. "And what exactly do you suppose we'll find when examining the liver that would shed light on such a crime?" he asked, with not a small dose of vitriol in his voice. "You will find," said Crane, turning his back on the detective and proceeding at a brisk pace back toward the road, "the same thing you will have found with the others, that the liver is missing." Hours later, having arrived back at Norton Street and made some attempt to steady my nerves by taking the tea thoughtfully prepared for us by Mrs. Hatton, I was finally summoned to Crane's side for some explanation as to what was going on. Up until this point, I had been content to leave the man to his pursuits, having learnt over many years not to press and cajole him during one of his periods of focused concentration. I therefore resolved to retire to an armchair and watch from a respectful distance as Crane was taken up by one of those unmistakable whirlwinds of fascination and applied thought, during which he made calculations and deductions far beyond what would ever seem humanly possible. So it was that for several hours, whilst I worked to steady and calm myself in one corner of the study, Crane had by contrast moved around in a fit of feverish activity, drawing, it seemed every few minutes, another heavy tome from the shelves and leafing frantically through it, pausing only to examine with great care and the aid of a magnifying glass the sketches I had taken of that poor creature's scattered insides. Eventually he became still, sat up, straight-backed and rigid in a fashion that I immediately recognized as a signal, a resolution. Some conclusion or confirmation, be it for better or ill, had been reached. After some moments, during which he never moved a muscle, he eventually leaned forward and, with something approaching reluctance, unlocked a drawer in his desk and opened it. From inside, he carefully removed 3 small shaving mirrors and what appeared to be yet another volume, this one carefully wrapped up in cloth. Having tentatively opened the book, he placed it carefully into a V-shaped wooden book cradle upon his writing desk. He then proceeded to fix one mirror by means of a thread tied to the lamp at an angle above the text. The second he placed before himself, the reflective surface facing away at a right angle to the first, and tilted so that it showed the image reflected in the first mirror. Finally, he placed the third across the desk, so that its surface was facing back toward the second mirror and towards him. Having completed the assembly of this strange construction, Crane sighed heavily. Leaning back in his chair, he lit his pipe and called me to his side. As he beckoned to me, he gave instructions before I got too close that I was only to look into the mirror, and that I must not, at any cost, allow my eyes to fall upon the book that rested open upon his desk. Approaching slowly, I followed his instructions to the letter, and saw immediately that the result of this strange construction was to show in the third mirror, upright before him, the reflection of a reflection of what had been written on the page. It was notable to me as I observed his actions, the reluctance with which Crane seemed to handle the volume he had taken from the drawer, manoeuvring it, almost at arm's length, with motions that teetered somewhere on the boundary between extreme care and absolute disgust. Looking into the mirror, I recognized at once my friend's own handwriting above what appeared to be an insensible mess of crazed lines and incoherent scribbling. Why, I thought, should Crane be so repulsed by something that had clearly been written by his own hand? "These are my own copied notes, taken in carefully arranged and illicit sittings at the British Museum from photographs of a very particular book. A volume so notorious that its very existence is regarded by many to be little more than a myth." He paused, and, craning his neck upward to avoid looking at the page, gently turned it with a pair of tweezers. "In fact, this volume is both very real and very dangerous. There are extant copies, rumoured to be stored in the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Vatican, with a further 3 copies having found their way to the Americas. The text of which I speak, and from which these notes were taken, is none other than the fabled Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. How the villain has gained access to this text or to parts of it we may never know. I have heard it rumoured that in some clandestine quarters the text is preserved by having individual pages of the script tattooed onto the backs of children, and that these infants are then smuggled to various points across the globe for dedicated scribes to copy the text from. What we can be sure of is that whoever this individual is, he clearly has viewed the book or some portion of it, which in itself makes him a dangerous adversary. It is difficult for me to overstate to you just how foul and wicked a book this volume is, so insidious, in fact, that to view the names it contains in a printed form directly would be to risk madness, whilst to read those monikers aloud is to conjure things of which even madness cannot conceive. This configuration," he motioned toward the arrangement of mirrors, "allows us several degrees of separation from the printed word and the text itself. This incident, however, threatens to draw us far closer than ever we should be." Saying this, he held up the sketches I had made of the spilt entrails for me to examine. Holding them beside the mirror, he invited me to see the comparisons he had highlighted between the patterns on one and those on the other. It was an undeniable fact that they were a very close match, every curve and bend in the seemingly random strewing of organs marrying up with the ink-scrawled lines of what appeared, upon second viewing, to be some form of grotesque language. "What in God's name is it, Crane?" I asked, horrified by the similarities. "Careful, my friend. You are closer to the truth with your exclamations than you know." Shifting in his chair and turning toward me, though never quite allowing himself to offer his back to the volume, he knocked out the tobacco of his pipe roughly onto the desk. "We are spared any detrimental effects in the viewing by the crude nature of the artist's medium. It is impossible, using the materials the murderer had." By this I took him to mean the entrails that the fiend had deliberately manipulated to form something approaching words. "To replicate the subtleties of the written text exactly. The diacritics and swirling flourishes would be impossible to replicate in this form, but it is a good enough approximation for it to be identifiable, and worryingly, for it also to be effective." I looked from the parallel scripts, one sketched in pencil by my own hand, the other more detailed and in ink by Crane, and thought back to how I had first seen it, in the stinking damp of that alleyway. Crane went on. "In ancient Rome, Greece, and in both the Hittite and Etruscan traditions, there existed within the spiritual practices of the people a process of divination which we now refer to as haruspicy, a form of extispicy. Essentially, this is a process for interpreting messages from the gods through examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals. In these traditions, the haruspex, that is, the person in charge of interpreting the signs, would examine the innards, particularly the livers and other organs, of a sacrificed animal, usually a goat or lamb, and read within its shape, contours, and markings messages from the gods. Omens, portents, and predictions of future events were all thought to come from such processes. The practice was widespread in the ancient Near East and was held in high regard. In fact, there are clay models of lamb's livers relating to such rituals in the collections of the British Museum. Those artifacts date back to 1900 BC and the kingdoms of Babylon, the ruins of which were supposedly visited by Alhazred himself. You think that this murder is some warped version of this ritual? That is why you assumed that the liver would be missing, I gasped. Crane nodded. In part, though there is more to it than that. As you are aware, I am a man who, within his own scope of interest, likes to remain well informed. To that end, I have a reliable network of informants and acquaintances ready to alert me of particular goings-on within the city. One phenomenon that I am very keen to keep abreast of, maudlin as it may seem, is the killing of domestic animals. Not slaughter for meat in the butchers and abattoirs, but any killings of dogs, cats, rodents, and swine that seem to go beyond the most basic pest control. In my experience, a rise in such incidents is often a harbinger of worse to come, and correlates directly with a rise in attacks on human beings. Almost a full year ago, I was informed by a city rat-catcher and 2 paper-boys in my employ of animals that had not only been killed, but butchered in a very particular way. Whilst I was not able to examine these carcasses first-hand, the descriptions given to me by my informants match almost precisely the details you witnessed for yourself earlier today. I made it my business to keep the constabulary informed of my suspicions, and even went to the lengths of consulting Cooper on the matter, explaining why I suspected that very soon there could be a human victim killed in just such a manner. He was predictably dismissive and insisted that the constabulary was there to solve crimes that had happened, not those that gentlemen such as myself supposed might happen at some indeterminate point in the future. Having reminded him that the constabulary's aim was in fact to prevent crime, I also made him swear that if such an incident did occur, he would let me know. I mistakenly believed that a mild acquaintance with my reputation as a detective and a close acquaintance with a few coins of the realm might be enough to pry such an oath from him, and indeed he did give me his word. Yet it was an oath that he happily and foolishly neglected to keep until this morning. There have been 5 others. 5 victims killed in this similar fashion over the past 6 months. For 6 months, Cooper and his ilk have fumbled dangerously and incompetently at the evidence like a troop of orangutans armed with pistols. In their haste and secrecy, they have destroyed and corrupted important evidence and details that, had they been shared, might have enabled us to prevent further casualties. As things stand, it is only the pressure he has suffered on account of his men's evident lack of progress that has forced him to seek outside assistance, and even then only on condition that my involvement be masked with the utmost secrecy. I was finally afforded the chance to examine a body prior to his team's meddling at the incident upon which you also attended. I am sad to say that my observations have confirmed my earlier suspicions, but I'm also glad that it has perhaps provided us with an opportunity to end this horror. It is now beyond a doubt that these murders do not simply represent acts of random violence, crimes of passion, or obsession, but are rather the performance of carefully considered ritualistic sacrifice, offerings to a priest, himself of proportions almost beyond imagining, who is but a servant to older and far more terrible gods. My head was, of course, filled with questions, foremost amongst them being how my friend who had, until this point, shown himself to be of the most rational species of skeptic, could accept such notions as true. When I opened my mouth to ask, however, I found that the questions jostled and fought, clambering over one another in desperation to emerge and preventing any one individual from escaping through the aperture. Crane, noting my confusion, sat back and tried as best he could to explain. "The words you have seen formed from flesh, taken from that damnable book, are in fact names, Edwards. filthy, forbidden, and half-forgotten names of things that lurk beyond the veil of this reality. By repeating them, forming them in such a fashion, is making an offering in the hope of receiving an answer. He does so in the full and firm belief that such actions will grant him the boon of a message formed upon the liver of the victim. The victim is the sacrifice, the written name is the entity being consulted, and the liver. Here Crane swallowed hard, and for a flickering instant seemed to hesitate with what, had I not known better, I might have described as a look of fear upon his face. The liver is the thing's response. The first point of note from today's scene is the name itself. Whilst I held no desire to see this monstrosity written down, it has allowed me, through reference to my previous studies, to identify the entity to which this misguided supplicant is calling. We can see not only who, or what he wishes to call unto, but what answer he hopes to receive, for as well as providing information and warnings about these entities and detailing the offerings that can be used to please them, the Kitab al-Azif, that is the Necronomicon, also contains spells that equate specific entities with what they might provide to their worshippers. Some promise power, some gold, some only the false promise of mercy when, with horrible inevitability, these old ones return to claim this world. In the case of the thing appeased by this haruspex, the reward seems to be the power of resurrection, the ability, by some strange right, to bring back from the dead those who have already passed. Whoever this criminal might be, his intention in this meddling is to bring someone back from beyond the veil. For a moment I considered saying that this was impossible, only to chasten myself at the thought of how the multitudes gathered in church for services each Sunday morning might react to such an affirmation. Noting my hesitance, Crane nodded solemnly. "You have, Edwards, always known me to be a man of a calm and rational mind. I am not one prone to flights of fancy, nor have I ever failed to scrutinize any and all propositions and circumstances with a necessary level of cynicism. You will, I trust, therefore, take me at my word when I tell you that when men disregard considerations of what should be done in favor of what could, such feats as these and worse are more than possible. The question is not whether this fiend can raise the dead, but rather at what price. This, Edwards, is a far greater peril than even the murders themselves might suggest, for in opening lines of communication between this realm and the other, the seeker creates a conduit, a pathway through which things far more threatening than messages could travel. With every call upon the name of this wretched thing, and every sacrifice offered to it, it gains in strength, and the aperture, the gateway between our worlds, grows larger. This haruspex must be stopped, and soon, not only for the sake of his potential victims, but for all our sakes." "But how?" I asked. "Are we to identify the villain with almost nothing to go on?" Here Crane finally relaxed back into a more familiar pose. "On the contrary, my dear Edwards, with the information the killer has provided us through his deeds, we are now far closer to apprehending him." Saying this, he suddenly sprang up from his seat and, flipping open his pocket watch, marched toward the coat stand by the door. "It is now 1:15. On these winter days the sun will set at around 4 p.m. Meet me on the steps of the British Library at 5 p.m. By then I hope to have an answer." So it was that for the remainder of the day I felt within my breast as if some cursed tug-of-war were taking place. On the one hand I wished the hours away, looking forward in hope that some resolution might be found that would prevent catastrophe and any further pain. Yet, on the other, I also experienced the pull of trepidation, as with every passing moment I felt a creeping fear come upon me as the fateful hour approached. Finally, the moment arrived, and, as promised, Crane met me on the steps of that great institution, and with a wave of his hand beckoned me inside. Passing through the catalogues, the shelves of books, and the inquiry desk, Crane led me to a small nook between the stacks, where on a small desk by the window, lighted by the sombre glow of a single desk lamp, he had arranged a Stonehenge formation of volumes. These tomes were separated into 5 distinct stacks. Here, Edwards, are the texts pertaining to necromancy, magic, and the resurrection of the dead by means of witchcraft, which, according to their date stamps, were loaned from the library for an extended period within the last year. There is nothing in any of these books concerning the rotten branch of lore and legend with which our friend is tampering. However, it is not too much to suggest that before resorting to such extreme measures, he may first have dabbled in less extreme forms of the dark arts in an effort to achieve his aims. Now look closely. Taking 3 or 4 volumes from one of the piles, Crane opened each in a spread before him, then with his index finger pointed to the upper right-hand corners of the right-hand pages. Many of these volumes are of considerable age, the paper dried by the breath of decades. Such age makes the paper onto which the words are printed fragile. What you see here, he pointed to each of the spread volumes in turn. On these marked pages are slight breaks, hairline tears and creases in the texture of the paper. Now, reaching into his bag, he produced a small compact powder case of the type that a lady might use to store makeup. He then produced a brush and proceeded to dust the top corners of the page with a fine, dark powder. Whilst there had been cases, one notable example in Argentina, in which identification was made by means of matching fingerprints to the culprit, that science was at this time in its infancy. This, however, did not stop my friend from identifying that fingerprints and smudges were present. The grease and acids in our fingers can slightly damage paper of such age, and indeed leave marks that, whilst not entirely visible to the naked eye, can be seen with a slight dusting of a reactive powder. The prints, as you will see, are in similar points to the small breaks in the paper. Can you reason what might be curious about the placement of these prints and imperfections? "Left-handed," I answered almost immediately. The reader had turned the page from the top right-hand corner, a pattern common in left-handed readers, but had done so with some haste and slightly damaged the book. Crane regarded me closely and treated me to the first smile shared between us since the entire affair began. "Very good, Edwards. To be clear, I began by searching all of the books that referred to the topics in question. I narrowed that down to those taken from the library in the past year, which shrank the number considerably, and then examined each tome to single out volumes which showed recent use by a reader who happened to be left-handed. The books in this pile, all 9 of them, fit those parameters. I introduced the last variables on account of my observations this morning. When looking at the wretched tentacled face that the culprit made of the girl's innards, did you happen to notice how the mock tentacles had been cut? I shook my head to show that I had not. They had been slashed with a sharp instrument from top right to bottom left in a diagonal slash, as if the perpetrator was holding each bloody tube in his right hand because he was handling the instrument with his dominant left hand. Whilst I pointed out the bruises on the girl's thighs and how their discoloration indicated her profession, I did not mention those newer red and purple bruises on her wrists and throat, the deeper bruises of the wrist being again on the left-hand side, whilst the marks on the throat showed clearly that someone had closed their hand around the girl's windpipe, the placement of the thumbprint showing again that this was done by someone who was predominantly left-handed. Since we are looking for a left-handed killer, I thought it worth looking for a left-handed reader. Now, if you would be so kind, I would ask a small favour from you." Arriving as requested at the inquiry desk, I presented the librarian, a portly old gentleman with spectacles that rested so far down his nose that they seemed destined to tumble off at any moment, with the list of volumes that Crane had given to me, and, as per his instructions, reminded the old fellow that I was in need of those exact editions. The librarian regarded the list with a look of concern. "You say that it must be these specific editions?" I nodded, authoritatively trying to communicate through my expression the words, "those and those only." Clearly the expression was successful, as with a heavy sigh the librarian came around from his desk and began walking in the direction of the shelves. "I must say, sir, that your research takes you into some rather neglected corners. I dare say some of these editions have not been looked at for nearly a decade. You are certain that it needs to be—" I again gave him the expression. "Very well, though I should warn you that it may take some time for me to locate them all. Perhaps you had better take a seat here whilst I try to retrieve them for you." Glancing back toward the desk, I saw Crane slipping deftly behind it, and assured the old man, with a nod, that I was in no rush. "Take as much time as you need," I added merrily. After around 30 minutes, during which time the librarian had not once reappeared, Crane was at my elbow and urging me to my feet. Leaving the librarian still searching for the first of the listed volumes, one which Crane later informed me he had taken the trouble to deliberately misplace earlier that day, we rushed hurriedly for the door and out into what was now a pitch blackness that huddled beneath a blanket of thick London fog. Hailing a hansom, Crane clambered aboard and gave the driver orders for an address I had never heard him mention before. He also instructed the driver not to spare the horses in getting us there as quickly as possible. When the driver protested that the fog would make driving at speed difficult, Crane greased the wheels with the offer of a generous donation, and, soon enough, we were hurtling quickly and, it seemed to me, perilously along the narrow, cobbled streets. As we jerked heavily around another corner, Crane holding onto the window frame to steady himself, he began breathlessly to explain. "Whilst you are occupying the librarian," he began, shouting over the clacking racket of horseshoes on stone, "I sifted through the records to find who had loaned those particular volumes. Having found the name, I realized at once that it was one I recognized. Lord Arthur Turton loaned all 9 of those books. He is our left-handed reader, and perhaps our left-handed killer. Sir Arthur, you may remember, was the subject of a number of news stories early last year, when his wife Mallory, daughter Jessica, and their driver were tragically killed in an accident involving a hansom cab. Fearing that we might well meet a similar end, I gripped firmly to the leather strap that hung by the window of the cab and tried as I might to maintain my balance, as the cab jerked and veered wildly from side to side with every bump. Lord Arthur's wife and daughter were taken from him just over 1 year ago. In the time since, he has become somewhat of a recluse, retiring from society and only emerging to visit the library, and, if I'm right, to commit acts of unspeakable savagery. I have the address, taken from those records, but we must hurry, as I fear there is a further, even more sinister twist to this tale." Crane's flow was interrupted by an almighty jolt that rocked him forwards as the hansom hit some obstacle and one side rose up violently before righting itself and regaining its equilibrium. "At first," Crane shouted, his hair flying into his face with the force of the wind and speed at which we were hurtling forward, "I reasoned that Sir Arthur was the perfect suspect whose motivations were clear. He was a desperate man in mourning, driven by grief and anguish to the most wicked of ends in a bid to lift from the grave his beloved wife and daughter." From the brief outline Crane had provided, this certainly seemed the most likely scenario, and whilst nothing could justify the murder and mutilation of those young women, one could at least construct a chain of logic, lay the stepstones and follow the man's path into the darkness. As I was to find out, however, this was not the extent of Crane's discoveries. "That was only at first. There is an obvious problem. If Sir Arthur's crimes were, to his eyes, necessary offerings, a means by which to gain an answer, the rites and procedures needed to resurrect his wife and child, then why was he compelled to repeat the act, to kill multiple times? If he received his answer, if he was successful in resurrecting his beloved, then why should it be necessary to kill again? It could not be as simple as failure, for if the first attempt did not work despite the best efforts of the Haruspecs, then would not he have been discouraged from repeating so despicable an act? No, Edwards, there is another reason." As Crane pronounced the final word, the cab came to an abrupt stop. Both he and I jerked forwards, but whilst I then struggled to regain my balance, Crane used the forward inertia to spring from the carriage with an agility that never failed to surprise me. Having joined him on the road, I was led by way of an alley, eerily similar to the one we had visited that morning, around to the back of a large and clearly well-maintained townhouse. Slowing slightly, Crane eventually came to crouch by the cellar doors of the building. These wooden doors, at a horizontal slant at around ankle level, were presumably used by tradesmen and coal merchants to offload their wares and, when opened, led down by means of stone steps or a rampway into the basement of the house. As I watched, fascinated, Crane quietly unscrewed the top of his walking cane, a cane from which, on previous excursions, I had seen him draw a thin rapier sword that he kept concealed within the hollow length of the instrument. On this occasion, however, he dislodged from the detachable handle of the piece a small metal key, curiously bent so that it resembled a hair clip with two prongs. With lightning dexterity, he used this instrument, working it in swift, jerking motions into the keyhole, to quickly dispose of the padlock holding the shutter doors closed. He then lifted one of the doors and pressed his index finger to his lips to signify that I should remain silent. When first Crane flung back that door, I had wondered how we would enter without the aid of a lamp. Now I saw that a small amber glow, as of candlelight, enough indeed to assist our descent, was escaping from somewhere below. I reflected that, whilst this would make our entrance easier, it also increased the likelihood that this subterranean lair was currently occupied. Cautiously, and with movements that were almost feline in their stealth, Crane descended the stone steps into the cellar and waved a hand for me to follow. Whilst there was indeed a small glow coming from the wick of a single candle, much of the stone room remained immersed in darkness so thick that it seemed almost to have been painted on. What little light there was, however, remained sufficient for us to make out the dimensions of the room and what was held within the glow of the candle. It took but a second's glance to see that this was indeed the site of some strange endeavour, a notion reinforced by the etching upon the floor of strange geometric patterns, lines and stars enclosed in circles that were framed at strategic points with the same disgusting scrawl I had seen copied into Crane's notebook. In the centre of the room, resting before the candle and raised onto a plinth, was a pile of what looked to be sheets of aged vellum, stained with similarly warped calligraphy. At the top of this plinth was a statue, a squatting effigy of perhaps 30 centimetres in height. It was carved, it seemed to me, from some precious stone, opal or jade, and depicted in its hideous dimensions a figure that, whilst it retained the limbs and general proportions of a man, was in fact nothing of the sort. Catching sight of the thing's monstrous head, of the rippling knot of cephalopodic appendages that writhed in tangles from beneath its sloped forehead, and which comprised much of the lower portion of its face, I realized immediately that the mangled form was familiar. I had seen it before, seen its hateful outline sketched in a rudimentary approximation upon the chest and stomach of that girl's pale form. For a moment I felt a wave of nausea fold around me, and perhaps I would have vomited had I not been startled to a state of panicked alarm by a sound coming from the darkened corner of the room. For a moment we both remained in silence, staring into the wall of black that hunched beyond the boundary from which the candlelight itself seemed to shrink and recoil, past which no form or outline was discernible, and yet from out of which a sound, wet, heavy, and pregnant with the sly hush of smiling malevolence, slithered and rose up for us to hear. An electric crackle, like the sharpening caress of frost, flashed across my head and nape, bringing every hair to attention. Beside me, I could hear Crane's breath, steady and deliberate, as again, from the corner, came the sound as of something large but slick with moisture. Something crept out towards us. From some forgotten corner of my own mind, from some dark fathom never before visited and yet still undeniably there, shattered fragments of images began to rise, thoughts of things shifting in the depths with size and bulk of such enormity that their movements could alter the course of the tides. I thought again of great kings and older gods, of tentacles and the bitter cold of their texture, chill as long-dead flesh. I thought at once of frigid, rubbery, and boneless slack that one might feel were such tentacles to reach and fasten around an arm, or if, From out the black of night, the conical tip of such a succored form should subtly graze, but with a whispered caress, the skin of the lips as you roused yourself from sleep. I will confess that my first instinct was to run, to hurl myself headlong back up the stone steps, out of the cellar and into the familiar damp of the London night. Yet even this retreat was rendered impossible as my limbs refused to obey my wishes, remaining instead listless and watery, uselessly fixed by fear to the very centre of the room. Glancing to my right, I turned my head just in time to see Crane marching boldly forwards as he disappeared into the black. For a long time there was silence, an awful vacant blank of sight and sound that struck my heart with the deepest panic, until, from out of the dark, Crane once again emerged, dragging behind him by means of a hand fastened onto the wrist the milk-white form of a half-naked man. Imploring me to help, Crane grasped the corpse-like figure, seemingly more liquid than flesh, and heaved him bodily into the light. Never in my life have I seen such a pitiful form, a thing no longer a man, but a mocking, half-done imitation of life. The man, if he could be blessed with such a title, sported a large black beard, shot all over with flecks of white. The eyes were swollen shut, whilst the mouth, a black cavern from which the teeth, some snapped in half, had almost entirely been removed, gaped and splayed, soundless and tongueless, behind cracked lips that had not tasted water for what looked to be many days. The cheeks, testament to a starved emaciation of their owner, were sunken to such an extent that the skin curved in a convex arch inward from the bone, like the tattered remnants of sail fixed to a broken mast. The cuts, burns, and various other offences that covered the skin were obvious even from the first, and, as he writhed blind and open-mouthed upon the floor, he more closely resembled a worm than any human I had ever seen. As I stood, impotently frozen and fixed to the spot with terror, Crane released his grip, allowing the man to flop heavily onto the stone floor. Then, as the thing mewled and screeched, nodding over and over its pitiful excuse for a head, as if in affirmation, Crane drew the sheath from off his cane and removed the sword that had rested inside. As I lurched forward, imploring him to stop, he raised the blade above his head, clutching the shaft with both hands, and in a single downward thrust drove the steel point into the thing's throat, skewering it such that the tip of the blade scraped and clanked against the stone floor. Then, with a final wrenching twist, he finished the deed. The thing twitched, then fell silent. Looking at it, still and twisted in a mangled heap on the floor, it was apparent almost immediately that this was, or at least at some time had been, simply a man. Retrieving the blade, Crane turned and, ripping the candle from its place, held it aloft, lighting areas of the room previously concealed. Upon the walls, piled upon the shelves and hanging from hooks, was such a collection of instruments, iron pliers, scissors, pokers, and strange pointed objects, that at first I considered that the space might have been used for some kind of ironworks, or been the site of some barbarically primitive surgery. It was only as I saw the chair, affixed with its straps and chains, that the true horror of the scene began to come to me.
"When I found Sir Arthur's name at the library,"
Crane uttered, breathlessly, from behind me,
"I also looked at his other loans, the other texts he had requested and pursued. All of them, barring those relevant to magic, focused upon the topic of torture. Histories, techniques, and instruments. It seems Sir Arthur was driven not so much by grief, but by vengeance."
I looked again at the fleshy carcass prostrate on the floor, at the vicious and numerous horrifying injuries it had sustained, before Crane had, perhaps mercifully, put an end to its agony.
"Sir Arthur succeeded in bringing someone back, but it was not his wife or daughter. He had no interest in raising his loved ones, but instead resurrected the man who had taken them from him, the driver of the cab that had overturned, the man who had also been killed in the accident. Killed, that is, for the first time. With the help of things that should never be spoken of, Sir Arthur raised him, killed him, and raised him again, over and over, for months, no doubt to the delight of those who provided assistance. The many sacrifices, the need for new guidance, etched upon the organs of the innocent, was a way of ensuring that the filthy deed could continue. Death, torture, and rebirth again and again until Sir Arthur had slaked his thirst for retribution, or perhaps, more likely, indefinitely.
As Crane spoke, I was astonished to see that the cadaver at his feet had already begun to decompose. Its contours slid, as if melting, toward the ground in a manner that conjured for me the final lines of that tale by Mr. Poe, in which he speaks of a nearly liquid mess of loathsome, detestable putridity.
With every murder, with every resurrection and recitation of those unholy names, the things on the other side grew stronger, urging Sir Arthur on to ever more loathsome and violent ends, to continue with deeds that would fatten and strengthen them. I only pray that we have intervened in time. I hope you see, Edwards, that what I killed was not a man of this earth, that it had no business here, and that in ending its suffering I was providing a mercy, allowing it to return at last from whence it came, to sleep undisturbed, as we most hope the old ones also shall.
I could do little more than nod. Within the space of 2 hours, Sir Arthur had been arrested. As we had ridden toward the constabulary, Crane had explained to me that a stringent requirement in the performance of such rituals is that the adept commit to paper, in detail, the stages and actions he undertook as he performed them. This, he assured me, was a characteristic of much ritual magic, and was intended to ensure that the prospective conjurer was fully aware and cognizant of their actions as they performed them, that they had reflected upon the horrors they committed, or were required to commit, at each stage. In some traditions, this process acted as a breadcrumb trail, allowing the sorcerer to find his way back through the stages he had completed, to turn back and retrace his steps at any stage in the process. In some traditions, it was intended to chasten the adept, to make them consider and discourage them from venturing any further. In this most evil of traditions, however, it served to encourage, to spur the practitioner on, goading and needling them to revel and delight in the ecstasy of their misdeeds, all to feed and satiate the appetites of their masters. In either case, just as Crane had predicted, such records had indeed been kept by Sir Arthur and were found amongst his papers. These accounts, as they pertained to the murders, were detailed enough in the eyes of the law to constitute a confession. The portions of the text relating to resurrections and acts of torture, conjurations and strange gods, were omitted from the court documents after they were deemed to be the deluded ravings of a diseased mind. Sir Arthur escaped the hangman on grounds of insanity, and was committed instead to the Seward Sanatorium. After all, by the time the police arrived, all traces of the man who was supposedly brought back had vanished. I must say that I often wish that the memories of that night would proceed with them, to be forever forgotten, into the darkness of the void.
Grandma L.
I first moved on to the Carswell estate when I was 11. By the time I was 12, I knew who Grandma L was. In the past, the word witch would have been shouted and screamed, screeched and howled by an angry mob, pointing with accusing fingers toward the hut on the edge of town, or the hovel that rested just beyond the tree line. Now, though, when such monsters lurk not on the fringes but amongst us, it is in the muted tones of rumour and hearsay that such wicked stories are shared. It was not with a shout, but with a whisper, muttered in a school cloakroom one damp afternoon, that I first heard about the witch on the hill. It was 5 years later that I actually met her. Grandma L was the matriarch of one of the biggest, and, I don't think it would be unfair to say, most notorious families on the Carswell estate. Everyone knew a Clark. If you weren't related to, married to, or employed by one or another member of the family, then you clearly weren't from these parts. The older members of the family, L's 7 sons were all in some way involved in the building trade and indeed any job, from plastering to tiling, extensions to patios, that wasn't paid for by the council, or which, more likely, was never even broached with the council at all, would have some member of the Clark family involved. On a close-knit estate, they were the wool. As united as they were numerous, you would never cross one for fear of the rest, and in particular of L. As with every great terror of children, there were few details and even fewer specifics to L's story. So infrequently was she actually seen that some, including myself, had questioned on more than one occasion whether she existed at all. It was clear, however, that there was something about this woman, as even within the older generations a degree of reverence was paid to this motherly and yet somehow malevolent figure. In some stories, she was a Robin Hood-like character who sent stockings of fell-off-the-back-of-a-lorry gifts to needy families at Christmas, or slipped pleasingly heavy brown envelopes through the letterboxes of those recently made redundant. In other stories, she dealt out justice of a supernatural kind. According to my classmates, old Winston, who was often seen around the precinct with his 2 withered hands, became like that after he had slapped one of L's granddaughters during an argument. On another occasion, so they said, a boy who had graffitied the outside wall of her house was badly burnt a few days later in a freak accident involving a burst water pipe. The boy, who was scarred for life, or defaced if you will, spent the day after he was discharged from hospital voluntarily scrubbing the spray paint from that wall. The house to which that wall belonged was one of a row of 3 council-built bungalows that sat alone at the top of Marston's Hill. Many years earlier, a large supermarket chain had been granted permission to build in the area around the hill. The council, catching the scent of the money that would be generated by such a development, had moved and compensated those families whose houses were in the way of the planned site, and the supermarket had bought out those who owned their houses outright. These properties were then demolished to clear the way for the buildings, parking, and supplementary infrastructure that a large supermarket would require. All the houses, that is, except for L's. L's bungalow, the 3rd in the row, was the only one of the 3 that was occupied at the time, the tenants of the other 2 having left the properties boarded up many years before. L refused to move. Initially, representatives from the supermarket had reasoned that she was holding out for a better deal, and believed that by being the last man standing, she would receive a considerable lump sum for giving up her home. Indeed, they attempted to entice her to move with a succession of extremely generous offers, all of which were flatly, but politely, refused. Eventually, so the story goes, the supermarket appealed to the local MP for the area, John Ardyke. Rumoured, and later proven, to be taking large sums of money under the table to foreground the company's interests, Ardyke became increasingly impatient with L's stoutness, and, as a result, became more openly hostile in his approach to solving the impasse. As soon as he took over management of the issue, L began to receive threatening letters warning of legal action or worse. These letters were always returned to the postman the following day, each in a small glass bottle filled with ash. Eventually, Ardyke's difficulties with these letters extended to having them delivered in the first place. As a succession of Royal Mail employees openly refused to deliver them through the letterbox, or even to enter the garden, he was rumoured to have personally intervened to have them sacked. The one brave soul who did eventually post what amounted to a thinly veiled threat was given a letter in return to post on L's behalf. Which specific decision-maker at the supermarket this letter was intended for, or what it contained, we will never know. 2 weeks later, however, after spending millions demolishing houses in preparation for building, and no doubt contributing quite a sum to Ardyke's personal coffers, the company seemingly lost interest, whilst Ardyke, embarrassed and furious, lamented the loss of bribes to come and seethed. The 3 bungalows on the hill were left as the only survivors of the cull, untouched, intact, and alone. A few days later, 2 council workers, clearly directed from above, posted a sign covered in plastic to the door of L's house, The sign, intended to ease a bruised ego, read simply, "You'll be sorry, witch." Whether Elle and her family didn't see the sign or considered it a badge of honor is unclear. It remained there for nearly 2 years, until one day she calmly walked out of the house and unceremoniously set it alight. All of which meant that the first time I was forced to climb Marston's Hill and found myself standing by the gate of Elle's garden with the seemingly insane intention of actually entering the house itself, I was somewhat less than excited by the prospect. My reason for making this ridiculous errand was simple. It was my job. Sort of. In those days, people didn't buy their milk at the supermarket. Instead, the milk would be delivered to their doorstep by a milkman, and indeed, for many on the Carswell estate, it still is. This milkman would drive around in the early hours of each morning with his crates from the dairy and would drop off the requested number of pints, ready for the customer to splash on their cornflakes that morning. To help him in this task, our milkman, Tom, would usually have 3 or 4 lads from the local area whom he would employ to make the deliveries according to a set schedule each morning. For a while, when I was 16, I was one of these lads. Seeking to raise a few pounds, which would then inevitably be spent over the coming weekend, I had asked Tom about taking the job at the start of the school year. After a month or 2, during which thankfully I was never called upon to leave milk at the end of Elle's garden, Tom usually taking that responsibility himself, I realized that the early mornings were adversely affecting my schoolwork. I reluctantly informed Tom that I would no longer be able to continue delivering the milk. To my relief, he suggested that I switch to collecting the money on a Thursday and Friday afternoon. This job, which involved similar pay to the deliveries, required me to simply visit the same houses that I had delivered to in the mornings and collect payment for the milk according to a list that Tom would compile in a small notebook. The same houses, that is, except for one. In most cases, when collecting payment for the deliveries, the transaction would be completed on the doorstep. All too often you would stand in the drizzle, pacing from one foot to the other in an attempt to stay warm, whilst the client, comfortably dry in their porch or hallway, fished around in a purse for the exact change. Other times, such as at the local old people's home, the collection took a little longer and was actually more like a short visit, during which you would catch up with the client, ask after their children, and listen to them as they told the same joke as the previous week and complained about the weather. Though it wasn't technically in the job description, this type of thing was actively encouraged by Tom, who at times would highlight a certain individual and tell you, "Just spend a bit of time with this chap tonight, his dog's just died." Or, "Stop and have a brew with this old girl this week, she sounded a bit lonely last week." It was a part of the job that the people visited seemed to really appreciate, and, though it seems a strange thing for a 16-year-old to want to do with his evenings, something I really enjoyed. You honestly don't know who's living in your community until you have a cup of tea with them. Some of them were fascinating. There was Mr. Bedson, the old man who had fought in World War II and had a passion for photography. Every week he'd regale me with tales of his times in the army, and on one occasion even allowed me into the dark room he had set up in his back bedroom to look at some of his old snaps. There was Mrs. Floyd, the great-grandmother who surprised me on one visit by rolling up her sleeve to reveal an arm and shoulder entirely covered in tattoos. There was old Louis, who spoke in a Glaswegian accent so thick it was virtually indecipherable, despite the fact that he had never even been to Scotland. Jan, the Norwegian gardener whom I would always find in his garden with his sleeves rolled up, no matter how cold it was, and, of course, most fascinating of all, there was Elle. In the case of the house on the hill, it was to be one of these visits. Elle, Tom informed me, was not only getting on in years, but had a wooden leg, which made it somewhat difficult for her to move around. It would therefore be necessary for me to not only knock, but actually go inside the house and converse. It's strange, but I still remember exactly what the order I was to collect from Elle's place was. Payment for 2 pints of semi-skimmed and a bottle of orange juice. I also remember that the first time I was ever called upon to knock on her door, I seriously contemplated running away. I couldn't help it. I remember staring at the order and wondering whether, instead of visiting the house, I could simply add the money to the collected funds myself out of my own pocket and pretend to have collected it. The cash would be the same, The tick would go in the book. Who'd ever know? The obvious flaw in this plan was that I had already spent the previous week's wages, and therefore had no money to put into the collection even if I wanted to. Not to mention what would happen if Elle inquired as to why she was suddenly receiving free milk. Still, I was petrified. My mind flashed back to all those autumnal nights when a group of us would dare each other just to enter the garden, let alone touch, or, God forbid, open the door. Now, only a few years later, and still more of a child than I would ever have openly admitted, I stood in the fading twilight, alone on the hill, with what, if the reports were to be believed, was a monster. Even the house itself seemed to squat and watch with malicious intent. The row of 3 bungalows were terraced, so they looked like one single long block, sharing a roof, but with separate gardens and front doors, divided from each other by interior walls. Whilst Elle's house had flowers and hanging baskets blooming outside, the other 2 dwellings, connected by bricks and mortar to hers, were boarded up and dilapidated. The gardens, if they could even be called that, were overgrown tangles of weeds and waist-high grass. The overall impression reminded me, sickeningly, of my great-aunt's face after she had suffered a stroke, one half leaning and palsied, whilst the other retained the light and glow that it always had. The houses to the right seemed to have atrophied, withered on the vine as if tainted and polluted by some poison. I stood at the gate for a full minute, standing there, with nothing but the whispering breeze through overgrown grass for company. I thought again of the whispers of children and all the heavy dread that comes with the name witch. And yet there was something else in me, a sense of duty to Tom and a stubborn adolescent refusal to remain a child. I gritted my teeth, muttered something to myself about not being stupid, and there being no such thing as witches, and rapped on the door. At first there was no reply. I waited, noticing in a way that I never normally would that it was getting darker. As the shadows pooled and bled into one another, they seemed to me to be conspiring together to paint over the light and block my exit. At that moment the door swung open. Upon entering the house, 2 things struck me in quick succession. The first was the enormity of the place. Even a few steps inside revealed the outside of the house to be a cunning subterfuge. The walls, separating one terraced house from the other, had been knocked through, undoubtedly by one of Elle's many sons. Whilst from the outside it appeared that only one property was occupied, inside it was revealed that all 3 had been knocked together. Being bungalows, the result of these modifications was to create one immensely long room. Aside from its size, however, the room itself was not markedly different to those I had seen in other residence homes, though, notably, there was no bed. All of this I took in an instant, my attention more immediately captured by the second thing that I saw. In the middle of the room, a few feet from an ancient-looking rocking chair, was what appeared at first glance to be a large pile of dark fabric. It took me a few seconds to notice the frail white hand protruding from the mass. The next few moments were a blur. One thing I can say for certain, however, is that in that moment all superstition vanished from my mind. This was real-world fear, white-hot, immediate, and tangible. I bent down, pulled back the fabric which had ridden up over Elle's head, and felt for a pulse. It was a horrible way to first see someone. Her head, covered in short curls of snow-white hair, seemed so tiny and fragile. Skeletally thin, with a milky pallor, my thoughts flashed immediately to my great-aunt in her last days, how all I'd wanted to do was swaddle her up and protect her. As it was, I did swaddle Elle, having partially remembered some first-aid class from school and the importance of keeping people warm. I took the heavy blanket from the chair and, laying it over her, brought my mouth close to her ear. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm getting help, but I'll be back." With Elle's house being so isolated, running to a neighbour wasn't an option. Instead, I ran down Marston's Hill, my legs freewheeling beneath me so that I almost stumbled several times. When I reached the bottom, I bundled into the phone box and dialed 999. The operators were clearly local, aware of the rumours and seasoned victims of prank calls relating to this address. It took 3 attempts for them to take me seriously. Having been assured that an ambulance was on its way, I then sprinted back to the top of the hill that earlier I had gingerly dragged myself up, and waited by Elle's crumpled form until the ambulance arrived. When I had seen that she had been loaded into the ambulance and shared with the drivers the names and addresses of the sons that I knew, I diligently traipsed, shaken and breathless, back down Marston's Hill, and finished my round. When I finally met back up with Tom, an hour later than expected, I climbed into the passenger seat of the milk float and explained what had happened. Tom listened patiently and put one of his massive paws on my shoulder. "You did good tonight, lad," he pronounced, and handed me my wages, with an extra £10. "That's for being a hero," he said, and winked. That wasn't the only gift I received that week. The next morning, I was woken by a loud knocking at the door of a parent's house. Having spent the extra money and my wages underage drinking the previous evening, I was hoping on behalf of my hangover that the real owners of the house would be available to answer it. Unfortunately, a second, more insistent knock confirmed that they had gone out. Scrabbling downstairs and wondering why this person was so averse to the concept of doorbells, I woozily opened the door. My stomach, already delicate, somersaulted. It was Stephen Clark, eldest of Elle's sons, and a man with a reputation almost as mythic as hers. For one horrible moment, I considered the possibility that I could somehow be held responsible for what had happened to Elle. Suddenly, standing there in my boxer shorts with t-shirt on inside out, I felt incredibly vulnerable. Hi, Stephen. How's your mam?" I probed tentatively. Stephen's expression never changed. "Just came to say thanks for what you did for my mam," he said, ignoring my question completely, but also offering some relief from the sense of immediate peril. "This is for you, from Elle," he went on. He handed me a small rectangular box, of the type you might expect perfume or expensive cigars to be packaged in. With that, he turned and walked away. As he reached the gate and without turning round, he shouted, "Watch what you're doing with that, lad. It's strong stuff." At first, I was understandably nervous about opening the package. From Stephen's words, I had a slight suspicion that it might be some kind of intoxicant. The box was made of light pine wood. When I finally worked up the courage to open it at the hinge, I found that the inside was lined with satin. Lying upon this satin, like the body in an expensive-looking coffin, was something which looked to me like the sticks of charcoal we would use to sketch in art class. This charcoal stick was around 7 inches long and had a chalky texture to the touch. There was no note, no explanation, and I had no clue. I placed the gift carefully back into its box and returned, gratefully, to bed. With the exception of Tom, whom I had spoken to on the day itself, I told no one about my experience at Elle's house, not because of fear or any sense of duty, but because I didn't really think it was anyone else's business. Unfortunately, some people clearly didn't share my outlook. At the start of my next shift, after handing me the notebook with the list of orders, Tom paused and looked at me sternly. "You went inside Elle's house last week, didn't you, lad?" I nodded, yes. "Thought so. I hear she'd had the whole row knocked through into one big house. Is that right?" Again, I nodded. Tom's lips thinned as he pressed them together tightly, mulling over his next sentence and weighing his words carefully. "Well, it's a bit different now. You'll see what I mean when you get there. I dropped off the milk this morning because I was asked to by one of her lads, but I'm not sure there'll be anyone there today to pay for it. Go up and knock, but if nobody's there, you come straight out, you hear me?" Usually a perpetually jolly fellow, it was strange to see Tom so agitated. "What's going on?" I asked bluntly. Tom opened the passenger door to let me out. One of the ambulance drivers told Ardyke about the house. I didn't have to climb Marston's Hill to see the consequences of this leak. I could see it from the bottom. The previous week there had been 3 bungalows at the top of the hill. Now there was 1. Having gotten wind of the arrangement at Elle's home, John Ardyke MP had sent workers to the property, acting on the assumption that the Clarks owned only the first house in the row, and displaying the sort of petulant cruelty one usually associates with spoilt children. Ardyke made good on his threats to make Elle regret her stubbornness. Over the course of the next 3 days, the 2 properties not owned by the Clarks were razed to the ground. Whilst Elle lay recovering in hospital from a minor fall, Ardyke's minions, reportedly hired from another borough as local workers refused to participate, set about systematically demolishing the adjoining properties. Every brick, every wire, every pipe and plug were extracted and removed. The books, ornaments, and sundry personal possessions found in the properties were declared to have no known owner, and were either thrown in a skip or unceremoniously piled up in the front garden and burnt. A further consequence of this demolition was the impact it had on the remaining house. Having been knocked through to join the other properties, Elle's home now had no internal wall, meaning what remained on the hill was a 3-sided structure with a roof that extended into nothing. One whole side was left open to the elements. Seeing this from the bottom of the hill, I did wonder whether it was worth making the climb at all. It was December in the north of England, and with snow on the ground, the remaining shell of the house had been rendered uninhabitable. Perhaps, I supposed, someone was collecting the milk from here and taking it to wherever Elle was staying now. Maybe someone would be waiting at the top to meet me. So, reluctantly, I turned up the collar of my jacket against the sleet and marched up the hill. The first time I encountered Elle, crumpled and vulnerable on the floor, there was nothing remotely intimidating about her. She was instead the very picture of human frailty. The second time I met her, she was the very picture of a witch. Just as before, the door, clearly loose on its hinges, had opened of its own accord. I stepped inside and, within seconds, regretted it. There, seated in the same rocking chair I saw earlier, her back to the open space where a wall should have been, was Elle. Sleet fell in sidelong slashes onto her, coating her hair and the thick black dress she wore with glimmering splinters of ice. Her face, which only a week before had looked as fragile as porcelain, was hard and angular, as if carved from wood. She sat rigidly upright, her muscles taut and fingernails digging into the arms of the chair. Her eyes, which were of a cold Atlantic blue like the numb, dead eyes of a fish, seemed to have frozen into a venomous, spiteful hate. At first, the vision was enough to strike me dumb and force me to take a few retreating steps, but relying on the part of me that was becoming more man than boy, I hardened my resolve and spoke. "Bloody hell, Elle, you'll catch your death. Come on, let's get you up to your Stevens. You can't stay—"
"Sit down, boy," she interrupted decisively, in a voice deeper and louder than anything I'd have imagined could have emerged from her frame. Without a second thought, I sat on a nearby stool. On her lap she held a wooden box, similar to the one I had been given, but much larger. Without saying a word, she opened the box to reveal a pile of the same charcoal sticks I had received. Before I had a chance to ask what they were for, she leaned forward in her chair and fixed her eyes directly on mine. "My grandmother gave me these," she said, sliding an outstretched finger delicately along the length of each stick in turn. "These are the bones of Vinegar Tom, blackened by fire. Write the name of an enemy with these and they'll not cross you again. My mother wrote names and her mother before her." She paused here, and slowly and deliberately looked me up and down. She blinked a few times, as if pondering some great truth. Then she slowly closed the lid. For a second, her face softened, and she smiled. She said at last, nodding to herself as if satisfied. "I thought as much. Bury yours, lad. You'll not have the heart to use them." With that, she took out a small leather coin purse and, leaning towards me, handed me the exact payment in change for the milk. As she did, she took hold of my hand. Her fingers were icy. "Thank you," she said. "I'll pray for you." With that, she turned away, and I took my cue to leave. That was the last time I ever saw Elle. The next day, I threw the charcoal bone, still in its box, into the lake nearby to my house. I hope that it stays there. Whether she did pray for me, I don't know.
and I can honestly say it has never concerned me as much as the thought of who she might be praying to. For the details of my encounters with Elle you only have my word. My dealings with her ended that day. There are, however, a number of other details that the reader needs to know in order for me to consider my story complete. I present them to you as a simple list of verifiable facts. Make of them what you will. If you search Elizabeth Clark Witch in Google, the results will detail an incident from 1644 in which Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witch-finder General, oversaw the hanging of the confessed witch Elizabeth Clark in Essex, southern England. In the days before her execution, Clark, who had a wooden leg and whose mother, Elizabeth Clark the Elder, had also been hanged as a witch, confessed under torture to having kept and suckled at her breast several familiars. These demons, or imps, were in the guise of household pets. Their names included Pie Wacket, Peck in the Crown, and a dog named Vinegar Tom. The first image result you will find is a woodcut showing Hopkins, Clark, and these familiars. A copy of that same woodcut hung on the wall in Elle's house. A week after I last saw Elle, a story appeared in the local newspaper about John Ardyke MP. He had apparently been the victim of a practical joke, as a group of painters and decorators he had hired to touch up his living room and kitchen had instead painted every surface in a pitch-black charcoal before abandoning the job completely. Ardyke, who was said to be furious, had threatened legal action. Anyone able to find this incident in the local press of the time should also be able to easily locate the report from the same paper 2 weeks later, featuring the same house. The story is about a fire. Whilst Ardyke and his family were unharmed in the blaze that destroyed his home, tragedy did befall the family a month later when the widely respected MP fell ill with a rare neurological disorder. This disorder, which presents similar symptoms to those experienced in sickle cell, attacks the nervous system, exciting the pain receptors to the extent that modern anesthetics are almost entirely ineffective. John Ardyke died a week later, in agony. The lake into which I threw Elle's gift also featured in the paper that week due to a strange incident in which all of the fish, seemingly suffocated by some pollutant, floated up to the surface dead. Local businesses were investigated in connection with suspected pollution, but no conclusive evidence was ever found. Finally, it is worth noting that the late Mr. Ardyke's wife, Pamela, and his now grown-up daughter, Angela, are not on speaking terms. The root of the animosity between the two is that Mrs. Ardyke, a superstitious woman by all accounts, has publicly accused her daughter of being partly responsible for her husband's death. Her contention, it seems, is that his illness was in some way linked to a drawing the then 6-year-old Angela drew of her father. This drawing, upon which the word Daddy was crudely written in a child's looping hand, was drawn with a stick of charcoal, given to the young Angela by someone she described at the time as a nice old lady. Relics. I want to start this story in a bit of a strange way. I want to start where most stories end, or at least where most fairy tales end. So, before I get too deep into what happened, I want to tell you that Elaine and I did ride off into the sunset, and we did live happily ever after. Or at least we have, in the years since she told me. I think it's important for you to hear that. For you to know that, for us at least, for Elaine, there was a happy ending. After all the darkness. Most fairy tales begin with once upon a time. In the case of our fairy tale, I know that time to the minute. I first met Elaine at precisely 12 p.m. on the 18th of December, 2018. By 12:30 p.m., I was madly and hopelessly in love with her. It wasn't hard to do. Elaine is the sort of person who simply attracts affection to her, though, unfortunately, as I was to learn, her past makes it very difficult for her to accept it. For Elaine had a very strange and, in my view, frankly terrifying upbringing. But before we get to that, back to my own love story. You may be wondering how I can be so specific when pinning down the date and time that we first met. Well, that's simple. I know it was the 18th of December because that also happens to be my birthday. I know it was 12 p.m. because that was the exact moment, almost to the second, that Elaine spilt her scalding hot coffee all over my brand new shirt. Despite the fact that she had wandered into the Grand Café that morning, she had somehow managed to survive the first 3 months of university as the only person in the city who hadn't actually heard of the place, or, more pertinently, of the reason why it was so famous. For, aside from being the go-to place for posing hipsters and wannabe bohemians in the city, the Grand was also famous for the feature that gave the place its name. Specifically, the enormous grandfather clock that stood against the back wall, and which, depending who you talked to, was apparently between 70 and 150 years old. Whilst its age may have been up for debate, what was certainly not was its volume, as every hour on the hour it chimed so loudly that you could feel the vibrations in the Squire, another student haunt 2 doors down. Whilst anyone who has been to the Grand before or had even heard of the place would have been prepared for the chimes, Elaine clearly wasn't. As the oversized clock chimed, she very nearly jumped out of her skin, screaming loudly and throwing the café mocha she had just purchased all over the nearest bystander. As it happened, that bystander was actually a by-sitter who up until that point had been happily perched on a nearby stool, minding his own business and reading some drab academic paper written by an equally drab academic professor. Once the piping hot coffee landed on his back, however, he was persuaded to look away from his studies and join Elaine in a round of screaming. "Jesus Christ!" I remember saying, leaping from the stool and trying to claw at the back of my shirt like I was doing some kind of new dance craze. After a few seconds of pain, during which I managed to put together a fairly accurate picture of what had happened, I caught sight of Elaine. She was small, had bright ginger hair cut into a bob with a fringe, and looked as if she were wishing with every fibre of her being for the ground to open up and swallow her. I don't think I had ever seen a look of such absolute mortified embarrassment on a person's face, and certainly haven't since. Despite the fact that the scald was stinging quite a lot, and the fact that my new shirt was going to take quite a lot of cleaning, my first instinct was not to get angry or to throw out an accusation, but to protect her. Looking around at the scores of eyes fixed on the pair of us, waiting for me to explode into some fit of righteous anger, I decided that this poor young girl, who, had it been possible, would have actually cringed herself inside out by now, had suffered enough. "Oh, there you are," I said, to her quite obvious astonishment. Then, carrying on like nothing at all had happened, I added, "Here, sit down. I've saved you a seat. I'll grab you another coffee. What was it?" Following my lead with a permanent look of dazed confusion, Elaine accepted my offer of the stool next to mine and muttered softly, It was a mocha, but—" "A mocha? Great." I steamrolled over her objections and, holding up my hand to signal to James, the barista, who I knew fairly well from my American literature class, I ordered Elaine another drink, which I knew James would dutifully bring to the table, thereby avoiding any repeat of the coffee-throwing incident. Then I purposely surveyed the room, trying to catch the eyes of any rubbernecking gawkers who had interrupted their posing to enjoy the show. As one gaze after another fell back to whatever it was they were pretending to be doing, I plonked myself in the seat next to Elaine and grinned broadly. "Sorry for the charade," I said with genuine apology. "I just figured from your face that you weren't really enjoying being the centre of attention." Elaine dropped her eyes shyly in a way that made me think that perhaps she didn't like being the centre of my attention much either. "Thanks," she half whispered. I smiled, just in time for her to see it when she dared raise her head. "Sorry about the coffee. I just... the clock frightened me, and I jumped, and then—" I laughed along with her words, allowing the sound to ease her sentence to its conclusion without her needing to explain further. Nodding, I made a show of looking over my shoulder at the wet patch. "Really? I thought you just didn't like the pattern of my shirt. It is a bit bland." I might check out the stain later, and if it's an improvement, I'll keep it like that." Elaine laughed, and I realized as she did that it was the prettiest sound I had ever heard. Over the next 2 hours, and whilst consuming an unhealthy amount of caffeine, Elaine and I got to know each other. Eventually, she apologized and said that she needed to go in order to not be late for class, and I clumsily asked her if I could see her again and whether she would be willing to give me her number. The answer was the one I wanted, but it took a long time coming. Before agreeing to see me again, to share her number, and reciprocate what I hoped was my obvious interest in getting to know her better, Elaine paused for a very long time. In fact, pause isn't the right word for it, because the effect of watching her consider the idea was like the opposite of a pause. It was as if, in that moment, she believed that she was the only person in the world not on pause, as if, around her, reality had frozen and she had all the time in the world to consider the proposition, the cogs and springs inside her head visibly working and turning as she weighed up the options and seemed, somehow, to be wrestling internally with some opposing voice, a voice that was telling her not to give her number away, not to see this strange man again. For the observer, this process was like watching an entire discussion play out behind her eyes. It really was the strangest thing to see. But at the end of it, she said yes, and that was enough to make me happy. It was on our second meeting, what I consider our first date, that I found out to whom that other voice, the one she had been arguing with, really belonged. We had arranged to go for a meal, meeting at a local pizza restaurant that was slightly more upmarket than the usual fast food joints that I frequented, and a place I had suggested in a naked attempt to impress her. We had finished our meal, and as far as I could tell, had been having a really good time. Elaine had seemed far more relaxed during this meeting than she had during our first. She would still look away shyly any time I tried to pay her a compliment, and was undoubtedly a little more reserved than me, but she asked a lot more questions and laughed along with genuine amusement at my jokey answers. It was as we were leaving the restaurant that the strange thing happened. She had collected her coat and turned into the light when I noticed an eyelash on her cheek. In my household, we had always, half seriously, wished on eyelashes. If you should see one on another person's face or find one of your own fallen out, you would take it gently onto your fingertip, make a wish, and then blow it off to carry it into the great blue yonder and convey your wish to whoever or whatever might be listening and able to grant it. Thinking this might be a cute little piece of family mythology to introduce her to, and, I will admit, having a clear and fully formed wish ready to make, one that involved Elaine directly, I thought I'd gently remove the errant eyelash, take it onto the tip of my finger, and explain to her the tradition. I leaned forward and ever so gently lifted the tiny, curled hair from her cheek. As I did, however, Elaine recoiled as if I had pressed a piece of red-hot metal to her cheek. To say that she flinched at the gesture would be quite an understatement. She drew back in what, to anyone watching, looked like a motion of abject horror, before reversing direction and just as quickly snapping forwards her hand like a rattlesnake strike and gripping my wrist. With the other hand, she plucked the eyelash from my finger and then, as if coming to consciousness, catching sight of herself and realizing what she had done, again stepped back. There was a pause. A moment like stunned realization where Elaine simply stood, wide-eyed and silent, looking around her, confused at the other patrons and staff who were watching her, then turned to stare directly at me. In a single motion she then pressed her eyelash to her chest protectively, turned, and ran. I hurried out into the street after her, worried that I had inadvertently offended or upset her in some way. I called after her, but she sprinted clumsily away, almost slipping once or twice in the snow, and I thought it best not to chase her in case she fell. So, instead, I just stood there, hurt and confused, watching as her blood-red jacket and trails of copper-coloured hair shrank into the stark monochrome of the falling snow and the hazy darkness of the night. I didn't hear from Elaine for a week after that, and, despite my flurry of phone calls and text messages, received no reply. Usually I would have taken this as a simple rejection, finding the idea of pursuing a woman who clearly isn't interested not only slightly creepy, but actually a little bit deviant. When dates had ended badly in the past, or a girl had simply stopped replying, I had inquired as to why and whether they still wanted to see me. If no answer came, I let the matter drop. With Elaine it was hard to be so detached, and though all my modern gentleman sensibilities told me not to chase her if she didn't want to speak, there was another part of me, another instinct, that told me this wasn't the case. She had been interested. There had been a spark there, some unspoken electricity, beyond the jokes and the conversation that passed between us. That was real. Something had happened to end that date early. Something about the way I took that eyelash that made something snap inside her. Something, I believed, that I could apologize for and perhaps get a second chance. I had to try. For, since the moment we had met, I had been unable to get Elaine out of my mind. When the silence continued into a second week, however, I made a decision. It was unfair to keep bombarding someone who clearly wasn't interested, and with what was a somewhat painful dose of resignation, I resolved not to try again. A few days later, I wandered into the Grand and distractedly ordered a coffee. As I waited for my drink to arrive, searching the place in the half-hope of seeing Elaine huddled in some corner and waiting for me, I was approached by my friend. "Where have you been? I've been looking out for you for days." I shrugged, not wanting to explain why I had kept myself at home and avoided coming back here for almost a fortnight. Somehow, the idea that I was getting over a girl or depressed about a breakup after a single date seemed ridiculous. My friend returned my non-answer with a shrug of his own, but accompanied his with a knowing smile. "Well," he said with a smirk, "if you're interested, I have a message from that redhead girl you were talking to the other day." He held up a small envelope. My heart skipped, and I snatched the missive from his hand with almost as much speed as Elaine had taken the eyelash. "Whoa!" he laughed. "Someone's keen. She's been in a few times asking for you." I took up a pew at the nearest table, not even bothering to collect my coffee, and read what Elaine had written. In short, it was an apology. She explained that she had lost her phone, thinking she may have dropped it in her rush from the restaurant. She added that she still wanted to see me if I could forgive her, and promised to explain everything. At the bottom of the page was an address. I turned to my friend, wide-eyed and excited. He smiled broadly and nodded toward the door. "Go on, Prince Charming. I'll cancel your order and keep a free one for next time." I hesitated for a moment before he prompted me again. "Go on. You're clearly besotted. Get out of here. The coffee can wait." I nodded, swept up my coat and rushed out of the door, with my friend's calls of "Good luck!" echoing after me. When she came to the door of the apartment, Elaine was smiling. I don't think I've ever been so happy to see someone. The feeling was like finding something important that for a few moments you were convinced you had lost or misplaced. Like the time I left my passport in the taxi on the way to the airport, only for the Uber driver to come back to the airport and hand it in, just in time for me to collect it and make my flight. Seeing her standing there, in the doorway, bunny slippers and messy hair, I felt an enormous sense of gratitude. She invited me in, made us both tea, and asked me to take a seat. Once I had parked myself in the chair and she had brought over the teapot, she perched herself on the edge of a seat on the opposite side of the table and lifted what looked like a huge leather-bound book from under her chair and placed it on the table between us. The book was huge, around A2 size and entirely white. "I'm sorry about the other night," she said sheepishly, one hand resting on the cover of the book. "It's just the eyelash." I jumped in here with an apology of my own. "I'm sorry. I thought it was kind of cute, like a little tradition thing. But if I overstepped the mark or you just didn't want to be touched, I'm sorry. Now it was her turn to interrupt. "It wasn't your fault," she said flatly. "I do want to be touched," she said, before adding with a smile, "by you." Here she blushed, her cheeks taking on a gorgeous rose-coloured glow. "It wasn't you. It was the eyelash. It's mine. It belongs to me, and it's hard for me to get over the fact that it's mine. She sighed heavily. It's hard to explain, but if you don't mind, I want to try. I nodded, intrigued and not a little worried about where this conversation was headed. If you don't want to see me again after this, then I understand. But I thought I owed you an explanation for running out like that, she said. She sipped her tea, and I noticed as she raised the cup that her hand was shaking. I wanted to say that was ridiculous, that seeing her again had made my week, but I didn't. What she wanted to tell me was clearly important to her, and I didn't want to diminish its importance. Instead, I simply gestured to her to go on. With a gentle nod, Elaine opened the book and began to tell me about Mother. The book, it turned out, was a photograph album, filled not only with large-scale prints, but with newspaper cuttings. As I was to find out, these were illustrative. Like the etchings in a book of child's fairy tales, they went along with the narrative Elaine was about to unfold. It's one I have never fully gotten over. Elaine told me that the photographs had been taken by the police the day she finally left home, though she was sure they had other photos which, like that home, they chose instead to simply destroy. Until the age of 12, Elaine lived in a place she called the Pure House with her mother. This house, which Elaine had literally never left until the age of 12, was, for many years, her entire world. The first thing you noticed when looking at the photographs of this place was the whiteness. Everything, every surface, every edge, and every room was pure, unadulterated white. The bed sheets were white, the marble floor white, the countertops, doors, walls, ceiling, everything gleamed and shone like pristine snow. There was not a mark, not a smudge or stain anywhere. I had seen photographs of sterile rooms, operating theatres, or places that needed to be kept sealed because those inside were undergoing some kind of quarantine or medical procedure. Even they were not like this. This seemed unnatural. It reminded me of photography studios I had seen, in which one wall or one side of the room is pure white. In some photographs, it was difficult to get a sense of dimensions, the pure white making perspective, and even judging where the horizon line was, difficult. Later, Elaine would explain that sometimes this made balancing hard, as the eyes and the body's sense of equilibrium struggled to interpret things like depth and distance. Flipping slowly through the photographs, 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Most, however, fell under the heading of why? Had Elaine been ill? Was there some reason why she had been isolated in such a stark and barren-looking environment? The answer to the first question was no, she had not been ill. The answer to the second was yes, there had been a reason. Mother. The photographs, Elaine explained, had been taken 11 years ago, when she finally escaped from this place. Until that point, nobody knew it existed, or even that she existed. Her escape, she explained, had been prompted by her mother's death, and, she added with a hushed hesitation, by a birth. Elaine's mother, whose first name she never knew, referring to her only ever as Mother, was clearly suffering from severe mental health problems. From what she could piece together and from what the police told her afterwards, Elaine had learned that when she had been born, she had been a twin. However, her sister, Emily, had died of cot death before reaching the age of 6 months. Elaine's mother, she never mentioned a father, so I assumed he had disappeared at some earlier point, had been unable to cope with the loss. So damaged was she by the experience of having her child taken from her that she resolved never to have any part of Elaine taken from her again. In her mind, the taking from her was literal, as if the child, or at least its life, had been wrested from her arms, snatched and removed. She wasn't going to let it happen again. I had heard of parents keeping some relics of their children's youth. My own mother, for example, kept the clip that had been tied round the umbilical cord and what eventually became my belly button. She also had a small porcelain pot in which she had kept all of my milk teeth. Elaine's mother had the same, but rather than a single porcelain pot, she had boxes, and rather than simply milk teeth, she collected everything, and I do mean everything. The reason that every surface of the house had been painted white was to allow for easy collection of debris. Every hair that fell, every fingernail, every eyelash. Sweepings from Elaine's sheet, the dust formed from her skin cells was carefully swept into a bag. Removal of any detritus from the body was a ritualized act. Fingernails, kept painfully short, so that the tips were pink and raw, would be clipped twice a week and kept in small Ziploc bags that numbered into the hundreds. Every hair that fell from the head was meticulously collected and stored in a small glass container, lifted from the floors and blankets with tweezers. Her mother, she said, often followed behind her with a dustpan and a small brush, ready to sweep up anything that might fall. Elaine recounted, with the help of photographs, how she would bathe, hunched over and washed by hand by her mother, who would remove dead skin from the soles of her feet and her heels and scrape the greying off-white pulp into jars. Her bath water, never more than 4 inches and freezing cold to avoid losing too much skin or hair, would be sieved and strained so that the purplish gelatinous scum that collected on the surface could be siphoned off into cups and eventually pressed into small greyish-blue discs, like hamburgers, that would dry and then be stored in Tupperware boxes. Elaine slept in a pure white bed, on her back, with her hair attached by a halo of clothes pegs to wires at the end of the bed. This was to prevent excessive movement, but also to ensure that in the morning every scrap, every fallen hair, flake of earwax oozing from the nose or indeed eyelash, could be dutifully and meticulously swept up and conserved. All the while, Elaine would be admonished by her mother for being so wasteful and allowing these things to be lost. She recounted in detail her abject horror the first time she lost a tooth, how she had been terrified to tell her mother for fear of being scolded for giving away or abandoning another body part. In the end, her mother did scold her, and the tooth's removal involved leaning over a series of test tubes so that the blood and saliva excreted in the process could also be saved and kept. As she grew older and reached the edge of puberty, even her body hair was shaved and stored. I listened to this story of decade-long abuse in horror. Considering that she had been subjected to such regimented torment, it was surprising that Elaine had emerged as balanced as she had. Her reaction to the eyelash was an instinctive reflex, an instinctive urge to keep what was hers and retain it, a reflex she was trying, with the help of a therapist, to overcome. This, however, was not the end of the story. Before explaining how she had eventually escaped this whitewashed prison, Elaine seemed to veer off course with the narrative, meandering into some strange cul-de-sac about Estonian folklore. It turned out to be an important one. She explained that in Estonia, where her mother was originally from, there is a belief in a creature or entity called a krat. She detailed how her mother would talk about this creature every night, repeating the phrase, "The krat is coming soon," over and over under her breath, like some mantra or chant. To refer to the krat as a creature is perhaps being too generous. The idea behind the legend is that an individual can bring to life inanimate objects that assemble themselves into a form in order to make a body. In most variants on the tale, this is farming equipment, and indeed if you look up krat on Google, you will be met with images of a strangely assembled humanoid shape made of rakes, scythes, and other farming equipment that have somehow arranged themselves into an upright skeleton of sorts and begun to walk. Sometimes the krat was made up of wheat stalks, sticks, and dried leaves, or of reams of rusted wire that twisted and knotted together to form a shape, a body for whatever dark entity had been summoned. For make no mistake, the krat was a dark thing. In the old myths, one could summon this thing by offering 3 drops of blood to the devil. Once animated, the krat would become a loyal servant. How this tied into the already horrific story Elaine had unfolded escaped me at first, but eventually she explained her mother's twisted logic. When Elaine first reached adolescence and had her first menstrual cycle, it marked a new chapter in her abuse as this bodily effluvia was also collected. Unlike the other relics, however, this material was collected with great reverence and would, according to her mother, be used. Elaine was rescued from the Pure House a few days after her 12th birthday. Her mother had died a month earlier. The Pure House is no longer standing and indeed, according to Elaine, was razed to the ground by the very police officers who discovered it. Obviously, they believed that the purification brought by fire was the only thing that could cleanse the place of its memories. Though, of course, the memories stayed heavily and tangibly real for Elaine. Amongst those memories, and, she said, strongest amongst them, were the circumstances of her mother's death. For months before she expired, Elaine's mother had begun to gain weight, and it was clear after a few months that she was pregnant. During this entire time, she would tell Elaine, "The Crat is coming soon, and so is your sister. Emily is coming back." With tears in her eyes, Elaine told me how she found her mother seated on the pure white sofa, her stomach burst open, where something, using its tiny milk teeth, had chewed through to escape. She told of how, for almost a month, she had fed herself from the kitchen, the tattered corpse of her mother lying reclined on the sofa, still weeks away from smelling so bad that the neighbours called the police. Finally, she told me how, during all of that time, she was never once alone. She explained, with not a flicker of insincerity, how she had played with a thing that called itself her sister. A greyish-brown being, the size of a small toddler, whose skin and body was made up almost entirely of waste. Matted wads of rotten hair, years of skin and nail clippings that formed a twisted skeleton and which smiled at Elaine through several rows of what she now supposed to have been her own milk teeth. This thing, made up of Elaine's leavings, dragged behind it a jet-black placenta, joined by a thick pink umbilical cord like a string of sausages. It never harmed Elaine, but instead simply sat, never more than a few feet from Mother, and played with her, giving Elaine, for a few weeks at least, the experience of having a sister. It never spoke, but at night would sit behind her, twirling her hair, in things like fingers. When Elaine was found, and the police discovered what was hiding in the Pure House, she hadn't wanted to leave. This had been the only home she had ever known. Her mother, the only other human. Perverse as it was, she had accepted the hideous thing that cut itself from her mother's womb as a friend, a sibling, and had been inconsolable when she had watched the house burn, with the thing she referred to as Emily's Crat still mewling and screeching inside. She finished her story and waited, seemingly expecting me to bolt for the door. I must admit I was tempted. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I did, and the thought was horrifying. Elaine told me that she had been fostered at age 13 and eventually adopted by the same family, that with counselling and a loving home she had gone at least some way to forging a normal life, and that now, though they were not biologically linked, she knew what it was like to have a real mother and a real sister. She closed the book and told me that she hoped she would never have to open it again. Telling me, she said, was going to be her final word on the subject. She also suggested something strange. She had heard that as part of my literature course I was taking units in fiction writing and a module on fairy tales. She asked me if I would be prepared to write this story as fiction, to make it into a fairy tale, relegating the Crat to the folklore and myth in which it belonged. Just words on the page and stories on the tongue. The Crat was made up of things she had left behind. Now she wanted to leave it behind once and for all, and, just as her mother with wishes and relics had made the thing physical, now she wished to rob it of its physicality, to send it back to the page, to trap it, as she put it, in ideas and ink. She had shown me these things because she thought I needed to know. She thought I needed to know because she already knew, or at least hoped, that I would be around for a very long time. Finally, She reached into her pocket and produced a small box, which for a moment I thought might contain a ring, but when opened was revealed to contain, on a small white cushion, the eyelash I had removed from Elaine's cheek. I still have it, and, I am pleased to say, I also still have Elaine. What you have just heard is our fairy tale, and we plan to live happily ever after. Arnold's Letter. Dear Mother, I should begin by saying that I'm sorry. I know that Marie's death hit you hard in the days after the funeral. All you needed in the world was the shoulder of your son to cry upon. I know I wasn't there. I know that I should have been, and for that I am truly sorry. More so, however, I am sorry for the circumstances that led to my absence, the reason I couldn't be there, and the reason I can never let you weep for your child on any shoulder of mine. I know that when you read these words you will most likely throw down this letter in disgust, disregarding the rest of its message, and so I will tell you now. Throw it down. Walk away in tears. Vow to disown me and erase all memory that I ever was your child, but please do not destroy this letter. In the days, weeks, months, or years to come, when the sting has faded a little, the wound at least partially healed, you can come back to this letter and read what remains after the hurt. It is my story, my confession, and my reasons. First, however, I need to tell you, I killed Marie. As I anticipate that you will be returning to this letter, possibly damaged, after a long interval, please allow me to again say that I am sorry. It was not my intention to hurt you, or indeed Marie, whom I feel, in some ways perhaps, I may have granted a mercy. I am sorry for the pain I may have caused you, and any I may have caused her. I am not sorry for what I did, and, indeed, I wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Fear, dear Mother, is an excellent motivator. Through one fear we can be pushed, coerced, or persuaded to overcome others, like a man forced to walk the plank. The threat that pursues forces us forward, sometimes down roads paved with terrors. I have faced fear, Mother, horror beyond what you can imagine, and yet I hold no regret. Call me a coward, but fear forced my hand, a hand I can still move. Marie was not so lucky. Do you remember, Mother, that really hot summer, when we filled buckets and mugs from the taps and had water fights in the streets? How you scolded us, half-heartedly, for wetting the floor, then spurted us with water from an empty bottle of washing-up liquid, laughing and running into the street yourself. I can see your apron, sodden, and your hair, usually so tidy and neat, falling wildly out of place as you chased us on the cobbled stones. Marie loved that. I remember her that day. I romanticize it. In my memory, her hair, hanging in straggly, knotted strands, drips water that catches the sunlight, and she, laughing and giggling as only little girls can, deliberately shakes her head so that the droplets fly at me. I watch her laugh in memory, watch her run away. Run. Laugh. That's how I want to remember her, not as what she became. I know there is a God. I don't believe, I know. If the dark things exist, and Mother, they do, then the light things must too. When I looked at Marie, though, I often wondered which, dark or light, our God was supposed to be. How could a God, a real, loving God, who cares for his children,
Do that to someone. People talk of Jesus as a shepherd caring for his flock. They forget that every shepherd sends some lambs to slaughter. I never forgot. When your supposedly loving God is so recklessly, needlessly cruel, well, it's time to find a new God. I knew she was in there, of course, long after the body shut down. Locked-in syndrome, they call it nowadays. Locked in, but in there. Her brain was aware. She was aware, but she couldn't move a muscle. Her only access to the world a strained blinking of one blue eye. Trapped, caged, and tortured. Jesus wept. When I looked at her, I still saw Marie. But all I could think about was our scruffy old dog, Pixie. Do you remember, Mother, when she was hit by a car? Her tiny body spun horizontally and landed on the pavement with a thick, wet slap. I carried her into the house. Holding her was like holding a huge bag of carrots. The tiny bones had no rigidity anymore. The pieces, broken and unattached within the sack of skin, tumbled and slipped over each other. I laid her in front of our old electric fire and watched her as she died. If ever you doubt and need proof of the soul, watch something die. You see, in a second, the life disappear. The body is emptied, vacated, transformed, becomes a shell, an echoing husk, still, inanimate, and empty. Pixie's carcass wasn't Pixie. Pixie was somewhere else. I saw the same in Marie, that separation of body and soul. But she wasn't somewhere else. She had stayed, here, awake. The body, the shell, was reduced to a husk. The spark, the animation, the spirit and essence that was her remained. It lived within its vessel of flesh, its vehicle body that fades when we die, caught and cursed to living death. We are no more our bodies than a driver is a motor car, Mother. The car can be crashed, dismantled and sold for scrap, whilst the driver who controlled it made it race and spin, stop and start, gave it life, gets out and goes on. Marie's soul gave her car life, until the car was crushed with the driver still inside. God shows us the soul is separate from the body by trapping one within the other. It's his cruelest joke. I never laughed, and Marie, poor Marie, couldn't. Run, laugh, nothing. That isn't fair. I wrote those words on my bedroom wall. Behind the bookshelf, they're still there now. Of all the symbols I have used, all those dark and twisted signs, it's those words and the accusation they hold against God and his supposed purpose that remain the darkest. Marie saw me do it. I'd carried her, dead weight but far from dead, into my room and placed her on my bed. I wanted her to know that I knew she was in there, to know what the doctor had told me, why I was planning to do what I did, and that I knew she was in there and able to hear me. It was Dr. Linson, the same doctor who gave me a sticker for being brave when I was small, who burned the wart off my back and gave me syrup for my cough. The same doctor I trusted and respected as a friend. It was the very same who told me, "It'll happen to you." Some round here have called me a witch, but he, a doctor, like oracles of old, told me the future not as a guess, but in iron, terrible certainties. "It will happen to you." He'd done the tests, could tell from the blood. Suddenly the warmth was gone, and just like God, this familiar figure who, in a way, I knew and loved, crushed everything that was me and mine into powder and wiped the dust from his hands. I would be inside, trapped like Marie. Run, laugh, nothing. It would happen to me. But it hasn't. Because, unlike Marie, I have had help. My God doesn't love me, but my God, at least, is fair.
In many ways, a doctor is similar to a witch. Both have their herbs, their potions, and their books, and both can show what time seeks to conceal. Both, at times, are tiny gods. Where they differ is how they treat whispers in the dark. A doctor says they don't exist. A medium might turn an ear to listen. A witch, and only a witch, would choose to whisper back. It took me a year to pay for that book. I had some savings squirreled away, but only one half of the price he wanted. I showed him my wage slips, offered, if he would let me, to pay off the remainder in installments. For me, the clock was ticking. For him, it was not. He was unmoved. He'd made that mistake before, and, in his experience, with a few notable exceptions, those acquiring such books weren't around long enough after receiving them to pay off their debts. Not those owed to him, anyway. I explained that being one of those exceptions was the crux of my plan. "Isn't it always?" he sighed, before adding by way of caution. "If the book works, you'll have debts enough. Full payment in advance. No exceptions." And so, Mother, I waited. Over that year, I read. Devoured with omnivorous greed every mention I could find of the occult, demonology, and esoteric ritual magic. At first I refused to pay for other books, my sole object being to purchase that one volume that would give me what I needed, and instead travelled many miles, often walking, to numerous libraries and bookshops. Sometimes I would set off at night and walk until dawn. I'd stay all day, simply reading and making notes, and then, when night fell, I would walk back. At length, however, I discovered that with parsimony verging on torture, I could afford to put more aside. Some days I ate only bread, but if it came to the choice, bread or books, I ate nothing at all. But I bought the books, scores of them. You will remember, Mother, how my body changed, how your boy with ruddy cheeks withered and shrank across the month until he appeared as nothing more than a skeleton upon which someone had crudely painted skin. By the end of the year, I looked like Marie, and I began to feel like her too. It started in my hands, a quick spasm or a finger that wouldn't, when commanded, angle or bend as it should. Sometimes the simple act of lifting a spoon from a meagre bowl of soup became a near impossible task. My hand, as if held by some other force, would twitch and tremble till I strained and pulled the sinews of my wrist, trying in vain to control it. One terrible morning, I awoke to find I couldn't lift my head. The muscles in my neck, as if dissolved in the night, seemed to have liquefied, losing all tension, all control. Eventually, with a screaming wrench, I rolled to my side, and the feeling finally returned. I lay on the bed, sobbing wildly, the panic and fear like nothing before. I looked down to find that I'd soiled myself for the first time since I was a child, and you had calmly cleaned me up. I panicked at the thought that I hadn't felt it, so hard gripped had I been with fear. Fear that I had waited too long. The doctor had said around 3 years. Had I been cheated? Was it too late? To add to my indignity, I vomited loudly. That, Mother, is what real terror feels like. How, after that, could I ever fear the dark? That night, I bought the book. At first, for a month, nothing happened. Weeks before, I'd cleared my room. All that remained was a ragged mattress and a single ringed camping stove. The floor I had etched with circles and signs, symbols and names in salt and chalk. Some from above, some from below. Though I knew my calls would go one way. I stopped going to work. Every night I'd read the words and share the signs.
Standing naked with only a candle, I'd trace the 5-point star in the air, open the space for all to come. I'd face and bow to the points required, move at junctures from one circle to the next, tracing geometries with my steps as incantations foul and fair spilt from my lips, proud and clear. Still nothing happened. When, each morning, I was forced with the light of dawn to trace that star backward again, to close the ritual, I would retreat to my corner and cry. Eventually, I realized that I could not cut corners, that I would need to perform the rituals exactly as stated and to use the materials as stipulated, making sure to adhere to every detail. That would require work, not only study, but actual physical labor and distance covered to acquire the things I needed. It isn't so easy in this day and age to simply find a goat. They don't tend to venture into the narrow entries and cobbled back streets of the cities. To get one, I had to go outside of the city. I took a train into the hills and was forced to kill time for hours waiting in a wooded area across from the field. Stealing the goat was harder than I thought, not only because the thing kicked and squirmed, making a terrible screeched racket, but because the noise it did make brought the dogs, running and snapping towards me. I barely made it over the barbed wire fence before they were on me. A few moments more and I would surely have been mauled. The kid bleated and writhed in terror, pushing against the walls of the canvas sack I had brought for the job, but slung over my shoulder it was easy enough to carry. Can you imagine, Mother, how difficult it was for me to smuggle that thing into the house without anyone seeing, especially you? How upsetting it was for me to eventually have to cut out its tongue to stop it from screeching and alerting people to its presence. Can you imagine how heartbreaking it was for me a week later to sink my shovel into the newly turned earth and desecrate the grave of a child? All so that I could pull from the lid the nails that fastened closed the coffin. And how shattered, like a glass, trampled to smithereens, I became, when, after killing the goat, scratching a thin strip of its leather out to form the circle, and pinning it down with those nails from the grave, nothing came as a result. All that answered was silence. I had done everything correctly, followed the instructions to the letter, and still had nothing to show for my trouble but darkness and the creeping inevitability of my own horrific fate, a fate that no one but our Marie would understand. Still, I did not give up. You always taught me that if at first you don't succeed, you must try and try again. So I did, every night. 2 weeks in, I told Marie. I like to think she understood, that she could see, despite it all, where and why I'd birthed my plan. Once, as I fed her, my hand began to shake. Her eyes were fixed, but something in them changed, and I knew she saw. I knew that she knew. It would happen to me. I told her my plan, picked up the chalk and walked to the wall. Run, laugh, nothing. I read the words aloud, less for her than for me. I stood before them, my back to her, allowing their horrible, unbent truth to seep and sink through each of my pores. "Is this it?" I asked her the question. Like all that I asked her, it became rhetorical. Is this God's plan? Suddenly, an anger, a fear, and a spite boiled up like venom and seared through my veins. Taking the chalk, beneath I scrawled, "I choose no. I choose no." I stared again at the wall. Then I turned and looked at Marie. "Free will?" I asked her empty stare. "He," I added, "is no god of mine." As expected, both Marie and God said nothing. Later that night I tried again.
Nothing. Just a boy, naked in the dark, desperate and thin, reaching for anything. As the first streaks of dawn began to colour the sky, I knew that tears would follow. I began to believe it was over, that all hope was lost. For the first and only time, I considered ending it all. Rather death than this. I'd always been taught that suicide was a sin, the ultimate rejection of God's ultimate gift. But then, what gift was this? A present whose wrapping made the contents unusable? Was I, supposed to be grateful? To give the Almighty thanks for this broken gift? To consider myself lucky to view God's creation in rigid silence? To cry exultation for the endless procession of ceilings we'd see? I rolled onto my side and pressed my face against the bare wood, salt and chalk crusting my cheek as, curling, fetal, naked and pathetic, I sobbed to myself, muttering over and over that I choose no. It is only the trembling fawn, the smallest, weakest lambs, that catch the eyes of the wolf. So it was with me, and so it must be always. For only in the pit, the depths of desperation, clawing the sand at this, my lowest ebb, then and only then, did someone hear my call. For the first time in my life, I heard whispers in the dark. But it wasn't God who answered. At first I thought I'd dreamt it, that, as I had so many nights before, I'd cried myself to sleep, and somehow I had dreamt that thin and whispering voice. I propped myself up and stared into the darkness, staring towards the corner, and I knew, towards the cupboard. I thought how, as a child, I'd peeked from under the bedclothes, watched that door in horror, listening for a creak, watched for it to open just a tiny crack, for hands to slither snake-like out to grasp my leg. Now, sitting naked, a candle by my side, I stared again at the door as something in there spoke. The candle by my side I knew was almost spent. Soon it would expire, and I'd be there alone, groping in the dark. I held my breath and listened, straining now to hear clawing at the silence to the edge of sound. I sat in perfect stillness, every muscle taut, looking at the cupboard, listening for sounds behind the cupboard door. Something called my name. I stood, slowly, drenched in freezing sweat. I felt my breathing quicken as I forced myself to step, inching ever closer as my stomach seemed to melt. I felt a wave of nausea rising from its pit and, swallowing hard, wiped at my mouth with the back of one hand. The voice was tinny, somehow sounding thin. As I padded closer, it seemed somewhat to change, and somehow, through the shift in pitch, I heard the speaker smiling. I placed my hand upon the handle and felt a pang of doubt. Was there really, here, behind this flimsy door, something I had conjured up, that through my lines and symbols, my mutterings and murmurs, I had succeeded in dragging up something to hear from hell? And if it was, if all of that were true, did I really want to see it? This fiend from the pit? Did I want to see to prove all of this was real? All the good and evil, all the gods and monsters? In truth, I didn't know. Did I really want it? It didn't matter anyway. I knew what I didn't want. So, as my candle flickered and waned, I slowly turned the handle and drew back the door. The cupboard in my room was a room of its own, a recess or cubbyhole built into the wall. It stretched back for several feet. Now, standing before it, I peered into the dark. For a moment, behind the door, dark was all there was, just a square of blackness cut from the cloth of night. But then, a glimmer, maybe 4 feet up, a highlight in the blackness. The teeth of a smile. There was nothing else, or nothing I could see, just the mouth and lips. the edge of the chin hanging in the darkness like some wicked Cheshire cat. All the rest was darkness, all around was black, so the mouth just hung there, a sickly, sickening grin. The gums were swollen, bloated and pink, of a shade you would usually not find there. A slightly putrid rose. They bulged, firm and plump with jagged, spaced-out teeth. The skin around was milky white, which made the teeth seem yellow, stretching out to wicked points like the fangs of an animal. I stood in the darkness and felt my bowels give way. It never gave a name. It wasn't always there, and after each conversation it made me close the door, as if it didn't want me to see what it was doing. The voice was hideous. Every wretched syllable curled in clicks of spit, gobs of drool spilling over those red lips in long elastic stretches that disappeared below.
"Hello, Arnold,"
it said with a smile that made me retch. I spoke into the darkness, to this lonely light. I want it to stop. I want it not to happen. You can do that? You can make it stop?
"Yes."
It spilled in awful, liquid sounds. The light veered madly as the candle in my hand shook with my trembling and flicked wax onto the floor. I tightened my grip on its waxy firmness and, steadying my hand, raised my chin imperiously. I swallowed hard and stiffened my resolve. "Okay," I said. "Tell me how." I wanted to ask that first night, to tell this thing what I wanted, needed, and have it take the prospect away. But I had read for nearly a year. By then I knew better. "I know, Mother, that you might not believe. Things in the cupboard. I'm sure you think me mad. But I am not mad, Mother. I tell you it was there, as real as you and I. I could have reached forward and touched it. It was there, Mother, and it knew my name. Demons, I'd read, are not to be believed. If they can, they'll trap you, if you give them a chance. To tell them what I wanted, I needed to be sure. Any request I made must be carefully wrought. With just a single stray word, one turn of phrase, it can twist the meaning, and then it will have you. So, on that morning I managed not to tell. I was brave and waited, Mother. In a way, you would be proud. I knew already what the thing would want. Nothing is shown for nothing, naught is done for naught. It would need a sacrifice, some spilling of blood. But when it finally told me, it hurt me just the same. I wrote my wish upon the wall, just as I'd done at Marie's. I scratched and changed and mixed the words, working, toiling to get the phrasing right. There must be no error, no room for manoeuvre. It needed to be clear, and it needed to take place. For the next 60 years, this is my wish. I do not want to end up like Marie. No locked-in syndrome will ever touch my body. In that time, I want my soul to be encased in moving tissue, to be able to go outside, to feel the sun upon me, to interact with the world around me. I will grow old, healthy and strong. I want my limbs to move. In the event, I lost myself, deviated slightly. Still my words were clear, and I knew that thing was listening. A slow, mocking laughter before I heard it say,
"Thy will be done, Master. Thy will be done."
It was 2 days later that I finally killed Marie. The thing had said it needed it, for all I wished to happen. In the softest way, a pillow across her face. I watched again as the soul left the flesh, unmoving tissue, limbs that do not move, never able to go outside, to feel the sun upon her, never interacting with the world around her. I took her life and offered it to that thing in exchange for mine, so I could be free. I chose no. Our Marie died at 4:10. As far as I'm concerned, for years, she'd never lived. The following night, I closed the ritual, waved the pentangle backward. I dismissed that thing that asked such a price. It's been a year since that night, and all my symptoms have gone. The new doctor says it won't happen to me, yet I'm still not happy. For how could I be, Mother? My Marie is gone to who knows where. As the thing left that night, slithering back from wherever it came, it smiled again and laughed. Then it hissed the words that cut me to the bone. You will get your miracle, all that you have wished. You who never asked that both of you be well. I know that I didn't, Mother. I will always know. That will be my punishment for the next 60 years. I love you, Mother. Your son, Arnold. The words I've just reproduced were written sometime in the early 1960s. They represent a letter that extends to multiple pages and which, as you have heard, takes a very unusual direction. I found this letter in 2001, pressed between the pages of a Bible belonging to my great-aunt. Despite having never been close to her, and indeed only having a faint memory of having met her once during my childhood, as her only surviving relative, I was left both her house and its contents in her will. It was whilst clearing the house and looking through her sundry belongings that I stumbled across the words I have transcribed above. It is worth noting that in the form that I possessed them, these pages were in poor condition, having been torn and later taped back together. Clearly, the writer of these words correctly anticipated his mother's reaction and her subsequent return to the words at a much later date. The letter itself is now in the British Museum. I donated it alongside another much stranger item found at around the same time. When preparing the house for sale, I was required to cut down an old yew tree that stood within the grounds. A section of the tree was part of my donation. Within it, somehow, encased in its trunk, workers found the body of a sickly-looking young man. The tree's living tissue had grown and moved around him. He'd been able to feel the sun and able to go outside. His limbs, the limbs of the tree, forever moved, in any breeze that blew. Arnold, it seems, got his miracle. I hope beyond hope that soon enough he died, that his soul, trapped in the body, did not live on inside as the tree grew old, healthy, and strong. I fear, however, that from some dark place I hope never to go, a thing I hope never to meet, sees that tree and smiles. This has been Haunted Stories, 4 short horror stories, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.